In the frozen forests of Belgium, December 1944, German soldiers huddled in their foxholes as American artillery began to thunder. Shells screamed overhead. Nothing unusual for men who had survived 5 years of war. But this time, something was different. The explosions didn't crash into the ground. They burst in midair, scattering deadly fragments over the snow-covered fields. The foxholes that had once saved lives were suddenly useless. German troops were dying without warning, not from impact but from the air itself. No one in the German army had ever seen anything like it. The sky had turned into a weapon. Those soldiers didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing one of the most revolutionary technologies of World War II, the American proximity fuse, or as it was officially called, the VT fuse, meaning variable time. It was a device so advanced, even Germany's best scientists could hardly believe it existed. To understand how the Americans created it and how it changed modern warfare forever, we need to go back to a time when the outcome of the war was far from certain, and when science itself became a battlefield. In the early 1940s, the United States was still catching up in the arms race. Across the Atlantic, Nazi Germany's weapons engineers were making terrifying progress. Jet fighters, guided missiles, rockets that reached the edge of space. America's greatest advantage wasn't in technology, it was in numbers, resources, and industry. But in 1940, a small group of American scientists started working on something that could give their country a different kind of edge. A weapon that relied not just on power, but on precision. The idea behind the proximity fuse was simple but almost impossible to build. What if a shell could explode near a target? Not when it hit something, not at a timed interval, but automatically when it came close. If that could be done, anti-aircraft guns would no longer have to guess how high to set their fuses. Artillery shells could detonate in the air, showering enemy troops or aircraft with fragments at just the right moment. But in 1940, no one knew how to make such a fuse. The British had tried. The Germans had tried. Both had failed. The problem wasn't theory, it was engineering. To sense proximity, the fuse would need to contain a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, a power supply, and electronic circuits that could survive the shock of being fired from a gun, a force 20,000 times stronger than gravity. Vacuum tubes, the heart of all electronics back then, shattered easily. Even wristwatches broke under less stress. In short, it seemed impossible. Yet in Washington, D.C., a quiet, brilliant physicist named Merle Tuve believed it could be done. Tuve was not a soldier. He was a scientist who had worked on cosmic rays and ionospheric studies. But when war came, he turned his skills toward one goal, creating a fuse that could think for itself. Tuve gathered a team of experts under the newly formed National Defense Research Committee. Among them was a young physicist named James Van Allen, who would later become famous for discovering the radiation belts that bear his name. Together they began experimenting inside secret labs, trying to build a radio fuse small enough and tough enough to fit into a shell. Every attempt ended in failure. Tubes shattered, circuits shorted, the devices burned out or failed to respond. But Tuve refused to give up. His philosophy was simple: never try to make it perfect, just make it work. Then, in late 1941, after hundreds of prototypes, they achieved a breakthrough. A tiny vacuum tube, redesigned with thick glass, could survive being fired from a naval gun. It was a miracle of miniature engineering. For the first time, a fuse could sense its distance from a target and trigger an explosion automatically. The key was radio reflection. As the shell approached an object, the fuse's transmitter sent out radio waves. Those waves bounced back from the target. When the returning signal grew strong enough, meaning the shell was close, the fuse triggered the detonator. It was a small device with enormous implications. When the scientists tested the first prototypes, they could hardly believe the results. Anti-aircraft guns suddenly became far deadlier. Before, gunners had to rely on time fuses, guessing how long a shell would take to reach its target. Most shots missed by hundreds of feet. But with the new proximity fuse, a shell only had to come within a few meters of an aircraft to destroy it. It was so effective that U.S. officials immediately classified it as one of the most secret weapons of the war, on the same level of secrecy as the Manhattan Project. President Roosevelt himself was briefed on it personally. The fuse was first used in combat by the U.S. Navy in 1943. Japanese aircraft had been devastating American ships with kamikaze and dive bomb attacks. But when the proximity fuse entered service, everything changed. Suddenly, American anti-aircraft guns began hitting enemy planes at an unprecedented rate. One Navy report recorded kill ratios jumping from 1 in 177 shells to 1 in 32, an almost six-fold improvement. To protect the secret, the Army refused to use proximity fuses on land for fear that an unexploded shell might fall into enemy hands. Only the Navy and Marine Corps could use them, over the ocean, where failed shells would sink and vanish. In 1943 and 1944, as U.S. fleets advanced across the Pacific, Japanese pilots began to whisper rumors about magic guns, weapons that could shoot down planes that seemed far out of reach. The proximity fuse gave the Americans control of the skies over their fleets. But it wasn't until December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, that the world truly understood how devastating the fuse could be on land. That winter was one of the coldest in European history. The German army, desperate to reverse its losses, launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. It was Hitler's last gamble, an attempt to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. American troops, caught off guard, were forced to fight in freezing temperatures and deep snow. The weather was so bad that Allied planes couldn't fly. The skies were gray, filled with fog and snow. Artillery became the main weapon, and that's when the U.S. Army made a bold decision. General Eisenhower approved the use of proximity fuses on land for the first time. The order was clear: use them only when absolutely necessary and recover as few unexploded shells as possible. If the Germans captured one, the secret could be lost. On December 25, 1944, Christmas Day, American gunners began firing proximity-fused shells at advancing German troops near Bastogne. The results were horrifying for the enemy. Shells burst above the tree line, raining deadly fragments down on soldiers who thought they were safe in their foxholes. Instead of explosions hitting the ground, the air itself seemed to explode. German communications were filled with reports of new American artillery that explodes in the air. In one sector, General George S. Patton's Third Army used proximity fuses during a counterattack. In a single barrage, 702 German soldiers were killed or wounded. Patton, usually not one to praise technology, sent a telegram to Washington. "The new fuses have proven devastating. We are deeply grateful." The psychological effect was immense. German troops, used to timing artillery strikes, had no defense against airburst shells. Even trees and trenches offered little protection. After the battle, German engineers finally managed to recover a few unexploded shells. They carefully dismantled them, expecting to find some kind of timing device or magnet. Instead, they found something beyond anything they had imagined: a tiny, complex radio system built with vacuum tubes so small and strong that they could survive thousands of G-forces. When the reports reached German command, scientists were stunned. They realized they had underestimated American technology. One engineer reportedly said, "We did not think such a thing could be built, let alone mass-produced." And that was the other miracle, not just invention, but production. The American proximity fuse wasn't built by one lab or one company. It was the result of an industrial effort almost as large as the atomic bomb project. More than 22 million fuses were produced during the war, each one assembled by hand, tested and shipped to the front. Companies like Crosley, Sylvania, and Eastman Kodak turned their factories into electronics assembly lines. Tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, soldered tiny circuits under microscopes. The total cost reached more than $1 billion in 1940s dollars, the equivalent of tens of billions today. Each fuse contained miniature glass tubes, resistors, capacitors, and a tiny power source that activated only when the shell was fired. To prevent accidental detonation, the fuse remained asleep until it experienced the incredible acceleration of being fired. That shock triggered a battery to activate and the radio circuits to come alive. It was a masterpiece of wartime engineering and a triumph of mass production. While the Germans built a few hundred jet planes and rockets, the Americans built millions of proximity fuses. That difference, between a few prototypes and an industrial flood, defined the war's outcome. For German scientists who prided themselves on precision engineering, it was almost unthinkable. They had created wonders like the V-2 rocket, but they couldn't imagine producing something as intricate as a radio fuse in the tens of millions. The Americans had turned science into an industry. In the months after the Battle of the Bulge, as the Allies pushed toward Germany, proximity fuses continued to prove their worth. They were used in anti-aircraft guns, naval shells, and even in land artillery supporting infantry. Each time, they multiplied the effectiveness of firepower. By early 1945, the Allies had regained air superiority. German cities lay in ruins. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was collapsing. Among the many secret technologies that had shaped the war, radar, code breaking, jet propulsion, the proximity fuse was one of the least visible but most decisive. It gave the Allies a hidden advantage at a critical moment. When the war ended, captured German scientists were questioned about their research. Some admitted they had theorized about radio-controlled fuses, but dismissed the idea as impossible. They lacked the materials, the miniaturization, and the industrial scale to make it real. One report from a German officer stated, "We had thought the Americans were industrial giants but technological children. Now we see they are both." That realization marked a turning point. The war had shown that the United States was not just a land of factories. It was a nation that could unite science, industry, and strategy on a scale the world had never seen. And it all began with a small glass tube that could think. After 1945, the proximity fuse didn't disappear. It evolved. The same principles that guided those World War II shells became the foundation for modern missile guidance and radar-based triggering systems. The radio fuse had given birth to the age of electronic warfare. For the scientists who had built it, Tuve, Van Allen, and hundreds of others, it was both a triumph and a warning. They had proven that pure science could change the battlefield as much as armies could. In later interviews, James Van Allen recalled the moment they first tested a working fuse. The shell exploded perfectly near its target. The team stood in silence, realizing what they had created. It was, he said, a strange feeling, knowing that something so small could change the world in such a terrible way. By the end of the war, the proximity fuse had saved thousands of Allied lives and shortened countless battles. General Eisenhower would later call it one of the most important scientific developments of the war. And yet, for decades, few people outside military and scientific circles even knew it existed. Overshadowed by the atomic bomb, the proximity fuse remained a hidden story, a silent revolution buried inside artillery shells. In that winter of 1944, when German troops stared up at an exploding sky, they had no idea that what they were seeing wasn't magic or luck. It was science, perfected under fire. They never imagined that deep inside those shells were tiny radios, miniature transmitters and receivers built by factory workers halfway around the world. They couldn't have known that each shell carried the weight of thousands of experiments, failures, and breakthroughs. For the German soldiers caught under those airbursts, it felt like the heavens themselves had turned against them. For the American gunners who fired those rounds, it was a glimpse into the future of warfare, a future where intelligence, not just firepower, would decide victory. That was the power of the proximity fuse, a weapon so secret, so advanced that even when captured, it left the enemy in disbelief. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the world began to take stock of what had been gained and what had been lost. Across battlefields and laboratories, in the wreckage of factories and the ruins of cities, the spoils of war were not just land or power, but knowledge. Every nation began a quiet race to uncover the scientific secrets that had shaped the greatest conflict in human history. Among the piles of captured weapons, German engineers found themselves staring once more at the small metal device that had haunted their armies through the winter, the American proximity fuse. They studied it under magnifiers, dismantled every component, drew sketches, and took notes. They were experts in electronics. They had built radar, rockets, and guidance systems. But this was something else entirely. Inside each fuse lay a miniature radio transmitter, a receiver, a set of vacuum tubes smaller than any Germany had ever produced, and a power system so rugged it could survive the unimaginable shock of being fired from a cannon. It was not only ingenious, it was mass-produced perfection. The Germans had built masterpieces in laboratories. The Americans had built miracles by the millions. One German scientist wrote later, "We could not understand how such delicate instruments could be fired from guns and still function. We had believed the Americans incapable of this precision." For many of them, it was a humbling moment. They realized that while Germany had been strangled by shortages and bureaucracy, America had combined freedom, resources, and organization to turn theory into reality. The Allies also examined the impact. Reports flowed into Washington, London, and Ottawa. Commanders wrote that proximity fuses had changed artillery tactics forever. In the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz credited the fuses for saving entire fleets from kamikaze attacks. In Europe, General Bradley called them the most important new development in artillery since the invention of gunpowder. Merle Tuve, the man who had driven the project from the beginning, quietly returned to civilian life. He refused medals and publicity. He said only, "The work spoke for itself." For him and his team, the real victory was knowing they had built something that saved lives by ending battles faster. But in the shadow of triumph came a new question. What next? How could this new knowledge shape the peace to come? As the war ended, thousands of captured German scientists were brought to the United States and Britain under secret programs like Operation Paperclip. Among them were radar and missile experts who, when shown American proximity fuses, could hardly hide their amazement. Some admitted they had tried to create similar systems but had failed. They had no material strong enough, no vacuum tube small enough, and no factories capable of building them at scale. American engineers, on the other hand, were already moving forward. The wartime research laboratories, the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, the Naval Research Laboratory, and Bell Labs had learned lessons that would echo through the next century. Miniaturization, ruggedization, and electronic automation would soon fuel new inventions: guided missiles, early computers, radar homing devices, and eventually, space exploration. James Van Allen, one of the young physicists from Tuve's team, would later lead experiments that reached the edge of space. The same understanding of radiation, timing, and high-impact electronics that powered the proximity fuse helped his future rockets survive violent launch conditions. In a sense, every missile, every satellite, and every smart bomb of the modern era carries a tiny echo of that 1940s invention. For the American military, the fuse's success proved something far more important than its battlefield results. It showed that cooperation between scientists, engineers, industry, and the armed forces could win wars. That philosophy became the blueprint for the Cold War. The Pentagon began funding long-term partnerships with universities and private companies. The National Defense Research Committee evolved into the Office of Naval Research, and later agencies like DARPA, the birthplace of the internet, stealth technology, and precision weapons. The DNA of the proximity fuse lived inside them all. Yet for most of the soldiers who used the fuses, it was just another shell. Few ever learned what made it different. When they watched those mid-air explosions over enemy positions, they simply called it smart ammo. Only decades later would the public understand how revolutionary it truly was. Meanwhile, in Europe, German scientists continued to study the captured fuses long after the war. Their reports to the Allied Control Commission read like confessions of disbelief. One analysis, written in 1946, stated that the Americans have achieved miniaturization beyond any practical German expectation. Another noted that the U.S. industrial base had mastered a form of electronics production that will determine the future of warfare. They were right. From 1946 onward, proximity fuse technology was refined and adapted. Early post-war versions used transistors instead of vacuum tubes. They became smaller, faster, and more reliable. By the time of the Korean War, almost every major artillery shell and missile used some variant of the VT fuse. In anti-aircraft defense, The effect was immediate. Where World War II gunners had relied on massive barrages to bring down a single bomber, post-war systems could shoot one guided shell and hit almost every time. In the early Cold War, proximity fuses became the heart of surface-to-air missiles like the Nike Ajax and the Soviet SA-2. They turned defense from guesswork into science. Yet, beyond the laboratories, the story of the fuse remained largely untold. While the atomic bomb captured the world's imagination, the proximity fuse faded into the footnotes of history. Its secrecy, once vital, became obscurity. Only a few declassified documents hinted at its scale. Even among veterans, it was often remembered only as those Christmas shells that blew up in the air. But the engineers and workers who built them remembered differently. In dusty factories across America, tens of thousands of people had spent years soldering, testing, and assembling the tiny parts that made the impossible work. They worked under strict security. No one knew what the final product would do. Each person handled one small piece: a resistor, a glass bulb, a switch. Only later did they learn they had built the nerve system of a weapon that helped win the war. For many of them, it became a source of quiet pride. Some workers kept fragments of old fuse parts in drawers, reminders of a time when they, too, had changed the course of history without ever firing a shot. The post-war years also brought moral reflection. Scientists who had created the fuse debated its legacy. It was, after all, a killing device, one that had made artillery more lethal than ever. But it had also shortened battles, reduced civilian casualties, and saved aircrews who would otherwise have been lost in endless missions. Tuve himself believed that technology was neutral. It was people who decided how to use it. He argued that science should continue to push boundaries but must always remain guided by ethics. When asked about his wartime invention, he once said, "If we can make weapons smarter, perhaps one day we can make them unnecessary." Those words reflected a generation's hope that the horrors of total war had finally taught humanity a lesson. During the Cold War, both superpowers improved on the fuse concept. In the 1950s, radar-based proximity sensors became more sophisticated, capable of detecting not just distance but direction and velocity. In the 1960s, transistors replaced vacuum tubes entirely, allowing guidance systems small enough to fit into missiles like the Sidewinder and Sparrow. By the 1970s, integrated circuits and microprocessors had made smart weapons a reality. From artillery shells to nuclear warheads, every one of them owed something to the early proximity fuse. In a strange twist of history, some of the same German engineers who had studied captured fuses went on to work for American and Soviet missile programs, helping perfect the very technology they once could not imagine. War, as always, had turned enemies into collaborators in the next race for power. But for the men who had faced the weapon firsthand in 1944, the memory remained vivid. In post-war interviews, German veterans recalled the terror of watching shells explode above their heads. "It was as if the air itself hated us," one soldier said. Another remembered how even the sound was different. So many detonations in the air that it seemed like the sky was cracking open. They didn't know it then, but they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where the invisible signals of radio waves decided life and death. The psychological shock of those airbursts also influenced post-war tactics. Armies realized that cover was no longer enough. Survival meant constant movement, dispersion, and deception. Camouflage, decoys, and radar jamming became essential. A single invention had forced the entire world to rethink how wars were fought. When historians later ranked the technological achievements of World War II, the proximity fuse consistently appeared near the top, often just behind the atomic bomb and radar. Yet its impact on everyday military life may have been even greater. While nuclear weapons deterred wars, proximity fuses fought them. They made artillery, the oldest arm of modern war, young again. In 1953, the U.S. Department of Defense finally released limited information about the fuse to the public. Newspapers called it the miracle of the tiny radio. Scientists marveled at the ingenuity of making a working transmitter that could survive 20,000 Gs of force. For the first time, Americans learned that behind one of their greatest wartime victories lay not just bravery, but breathtaking science. Decades later, when veterans and engineers gathered at reunions, they often laughed about how close the project had come to failure. During one early test in 1942, a fuse malfunctioned and exploded too soon, showering the observation post with fragments. Instead of quitting, Tuve and his team simply built another. They didn't have time to doubt they had a war to. Frankly, it was that combination of urgency and creativity that defined wartime innovation. James Van Allen would later call it the most exhilarating period of scientific teamwork I ever experienced. He remembered how the lab would buzz day and night, filled with oscilloscopes, smoke, and coffee cups. We knew we were building something that mattered, he said. That's what kept us awake. By the end of the 20th century, the principles of the proximity Fuze had spread far beyond the battlefield. Civilian aircraft used similar sensors to detect altitude and terrain. Space probes used proximity detectors to land safely on distant worlds. Even the motion sensors in modern technology, the same ones that open doors or deploy airbags, trace their roots back to that wartime breakthrough. It was one of those rare inventions whose influence slipped quietly into everyday life, unseen but indispensable. And yet the original story of German disbelief, of frozen forests and exploding skies, remains one of the most powerful reminders of what human imagination can achieve when pushed to its limits. In 1990, long after the war, an elderly German scientist was interviewed about the weapons race of the 1940s. He smiled sadly when asked about the proximity fuse. "Ah, yes," he said. "That little radio that changed everything. We thought it was impossible. We were wrong. That was when I realized we had lost not just the war, but the future." His words summed up the entire saga. The war had shown that no army, however strong, could win without innovation, and no invention, however small, could be dismissed. The proximity fuse was proof. A palm-sized device built by anonymous workers and quiet scientists had reshaped global power. It was not the loudest weapon, nor the most famous. But in the white snows of Belgium and the gray skies over the Pacific, it had proven that science, courage, and industry together could change destiny. As night fell on those battlefields long ago, the last echoes of exploding shells faded into silence. Snow covered the craters, trees regrew, and the war became history. But somewhere in that silence still lies the story of a spark born from human genius and desperation that refused to die. The proximity fuse was more than just a weapon. It was a moment when humanity reached into the future, pulled out something extraordinary, and used it to survive. It was the triumph of imagination over impossibility. And when the German scientists finally admitted they'd never imagined such technology could exist, they weren't just acknowledging defeat. They were recognizing the dawn of a new age, one built not on dreams of conquest, but on the limitless potential of invention. You enjoyed this video? Make sure to give it a like, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history. Your support keeps us going and helps us bring you even more powerful, true stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.